Okay, hello everyone. Hope everyone had a great week. So essentially this week, Parshas Vayira. So we have the pasuk essentially where he's saying that Avram's on his third day and Hakadosh Baruch Hu appears to him, and then he comes out and he goes to greet the guests. So the pasuk says Ayomer, and it says Hakadosh Baruch Hu's name. So there's two shitas in what this if this name is Kodesh or Kol, meaning if it refers to actually Hashem or if it doesn't refer to Hashem. And the second shita in Rashi, as you see over here, davar after kodesh. So it's kodesh. So that means it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So essentially, what's happening in the pasuk is that Avram Avinu is telling HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he needs to wait. He needs to wait for him to do Achnasas Orchim. So the obvious kasha is that Achnasas Orchim is a mitzvah. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is right in front of you and he's talking to you, so what sense does it make to have chutzpah, tell HaKadosh Baruch Hu to wait and then to go do a mitzvah, which is just to be close to him, mamash being having a tremendous amount of chutzpah, by telling him to wait for you to do a mitzvah. So what is the logic in such a thing? So what is Abram really doing with that? That's kasha number one. Kasha number two is that seemingly the whole idea of the Achnasas Orchim of Avraham Avinu is a charade. Because essentially what's happening is that the people whom he is doing Achnasas Orchim for are not real people. And in fact, in the Psukim later on, it mentions that when it says that the people ate his things, it just means that it looked like they ate it. They didn't really eat it. So it comes out, and you look in the Gemara, but Matthias talks about how everything that Avram did for the guests here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for his children later on, and it quotes all sort of different places where HaKadosh Baruch Hu did the reciprocal thing for Avram's children, for Bnei Israel. And it's a very big shver because what we're saying is that Avram really wasn't doing anything because none of the chesed that he was doing for the people he was doing it for, did they need it because they're malachim. So if I do chesed for someone who doesn't need my chesed and it's not really receiving my chesed because it's not necessary for them, how can that be considered a schus? It's just a charade. So Avram is feeding food to people who don't eat it, and he's giving the machnas orchim for people who don't need housing, they don't need to be put anywhere because they're angels. So how does it make sense that this is the prime example of the chesed of Avraham Avinu in the Torah when really he's not doing any act of chesed, because an act of chesed is defined primarily by the fact that the person whom you are doing it for needs your chesed. If he doesn't need the chesed, he's not actually getting anything out of the mitzvah that you're doing. So then you didn't do an act of chesed because you're not helping anybody. So that's the second kasha. And then we have this Gemara we can above the The Gemara says like this. It says that it was the third day, and Shadrei Eliezer Lemefak Levara. So Avram Avinu, simple pshat, says that Avram Avinu sent out Eliezer to go outside to look for Archim. So Nafak V'loi Eshna. So Eliezer went out and he did not find any Archim. So he came back to Avram Avinu and he said, there are no Archim outside. So Amar, so he said, Avram said to himself, or he said to Eliezer, Loi mehem melech, I don't believe you. And the Gemara interrupts, Hainu da'ami taman, this is what we say over here in Eretz Yisrael, Leisam nusa ba'avdi. There's no belief in avodim. So Eliezer, even though his Beit Tzaddik was an Eved, so therefore there's no hamana in them. So Avram himself, nafak ihu, so Avram himself went out, and then chazai la'kadosh baruch hu b'koi abava. So he saw Kadosh Baruch Hu, Kadosh Baruch Hu was standing at the entrance to his home. And the Gemara says, Hainu d'chsiv al nasa avor me'alabdecha. So he says like this. So it says that Avram Avinu was in a tremendous tsar. And because he was in tsar, it was his inability to do chesed. So then HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent the three malachim. So the shaila really is, what is going on over here with this story that the Gemara is saying? In other words, Avram Avinu sends out Eliezer to go look, and Eliezer doesn't see anybody. And then Avram goes out himself, and he sees Hashem. And the Gemara is stating that they say in Eretz Yisrael that you can't believe a servant, a slave, an Aved. So the Gemara is implying that Eliezer was not to be believed. And obviously it's extremely schwer, because when Eliezer went out, the Taka wasn't anyone there, simply speaking. And then since when Avram went out, so then HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared, so Vayirai Love, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to him. And then when he brought the Malachim, so he could do it. But Eliezer, is not believable. It's just that when he went out, the Taka wasn't anybody there. When Avram went out, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the Malachim. So it's very hard to understand the Gemara. And then we also want to know, what is this idea that when Avram goes out, so he went out and then he saw Hashem. So that is that shaila. So begin and answer. And the answer starts with the famous Chazal. Chazal say that you see from this episode, in the beginning of Vayira, that the Lashon of Chazal is, the Lashon of Chazal is, Gadol here. The Lashon Chazal is Gadol Hachnas Archem Yeser Mi Kabbalas Penei Shechina. That's the Gemara in Shabbos. So that's the thing that Chazal are now from this episode. Now the shaila is, what does that mean? What does it mean that Gadol Hachnas Archem Yeser Kabbalas Penei Shechina? Chayra, in our view, the apex of Yiddishkeit is the idea that we are able to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if that's true, then Kabbalah Pnei Shechina would be the highest form of that. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mamish there, and he's showing up, and he is and he's relating to you. So Rashi's Lashon is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Shal B'Shleimai. So how can it be that there's something greater than Kabbalah Pnei Shechina? It's very hard to understand what that means. How could it be there's something gadol in Kabbalah Pnei Shechina? In our minds, we would say that the greatest possible experience we could have in our lives is to have a direct conversation with the Rebbeinu Shalom. Yet Chazal are telling us otherwise. And to answer the question, you have to understand the basic, fascinating idea about the metzius of our relationship with Hashem. And that is that, in fact, there is no such thing as Hashem being nistar or being nigla. Kadosh Baruch Hu is not hidden or unhidden. Rather, what there is our level of awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if we get to a certain level, and we get to a certain level of awareness, then Mimela, we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are able to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and feel His presence, and ultimately have a conversation. And the side of that is based on the fact that the way that a person relates to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, since the ultimate definition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that He is the ultimate sense of metzius, of being, of simply existing, then relating to that as a human being is not possible. Like the Gemara says, the Baitid Bakun, and it says, is it possible for someone to be nidbak, to be stuck to the Shechina? No, it's not possible. So the Gemara interprets that rather you should go after Tamid Chachamim, and you should be mischaber to them, etc. So it's very clear from the Gemara that you can't be nidbak b'Shechina. It's not possible. And so rather, the way that it works is that, in fact, the parameter of closeness and awareness to the Yibbonim Shalom is on the scale of how similar or dissimilar you are to him. So if someone is similar to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the similarity makes it that he is more in reality, meaning more close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the ultimate sense of reality, so it means that he's more alive, more existing than someone who is less close. And this is really brought out, this is the definition of the term Ashrei. The definition of the term Ashrei is this exact idea, that someone, if you look throughout all of Tehillim, all of the places in which it discusses Ashrei someone is in reference to a mode of orientation towards the world which takes for granted HaKadosh Baruch Hu's existence. So let's say it's Ashrei Shelahav Basas Rishayim, or Ashrei Kol Chosei Bo, or Ashrei Misha Hashem Lo Chashav Lo Avo, Ein Baruch or Mia. Hashem doesn't consider that you have any sin. All of the Ashreis are all either talking about when a person is trusting in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or he's being holy in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ways, etc. So there's a certain level of real and actual existence that a person achieves when he is similar to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that level is called that he is considered to be Me'ushar, he's Ashrei. And we know that this is true because we have the idea that Chazal say that tzaddikim afilu b'misasim kruyin chayim, and rishayim afilu b'chayein kruyin mesim. Even when they're alive, they're considered to be dead. And really, if one would take the time to consider it, the fact of a person being physically alive is not life at all on its own. At best, it's survival, and a person can be probably in a place which is worse than death while they're alive, which, simply speaking, is the state of being that a person is in when they take their own life. I mean, that's the idea that someone could take their own life is l'chara haraya to that concept, that I can be alive, and my existence is so negative, it's even worse than non-existence, so I take my existence. The person takes their existence. That's a raya to that idea. So in fact, a person can very much be dead while they're alive. And in order to trace back, so essentially what's being said, and most probably there is nowhere throughout all of Chumash, or throughout all of Jewish history, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu relates to somebody if it didn't first come from that person, that he did something which would make it that it is an implication of the fact of what he is, that now he is aware of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu acted b'chesed and b'nigla, when he was goyal, let's say, the Jewish people from Mitzrayim, where they were Odei Avodah Zarah at the time, even there, it's before in the Psukim that it's because of the fact that Hashem made a Shvuah to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and since we were Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, so be'etzem, mitzad ourselves, we were in a place which is close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's just that it wasn't bought out yet because we didn't embrace our lineage as Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and even that is not true because actually the schusim that the Jewish people had to leave Mitzrayim was that they didn't embrace Egyptian culture, because we know that they kept their names and their clothing, and they didn't intermarry, and they didn't speak Lashon Hara about each other. So those four things are actually the schus that they went out of Mitzrayim, and those four things are also the things which make it that they are actually being genuine and keeping their integrity as Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, even though they didn't even do any mitzvahs yet. So, fine, but that's for a different time. The point over here is the idea that all relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu always has to be, and always is, simply a state of awareness as an implication of the fact that the person himself has come to a point in which he is similar and the same in a deep fashion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And that's the mitzvah of Ma'hu Af'ata. So just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu is this, you have to be this. That is that mitzvah. That mitzvah is essentially this idea that a person has to be similar to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when the Nevi'im do relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it is not separate from the knowledge that they have of themselves. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence to them is in proportion to their own self-knowledge of the fact that they are like Him. So that is the aside. And in fact, it says in the pasuk, and last week's parsha, it says, "Vayal Elokim me'al Avraham." It says God arose from upon Abraham, and Rashi says over there that from here you learn that the avos, hein merkava, the avos themselves are the merkava of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the concept of this is really a fascinating idea, and it's found in its most raw form in marriage, which is that, as is well known, in a marriage you have the ish and the isha, and the ish and the isha in marriage, the ish has a yud, the isha has a hey, and if you take the yud and the hey out of the ish and the isha, so it just goes back into ish, and there's just two parties consuming each other. Mashiach, if you put the yud in the man and the hey in the isha, so then it becomes a functional marriage. The yud and the hey make up the ka. So the idea becomes that the relationship of marriage is the first place, the main place which we have the concept of Ashras HaShechina. And the side of that starts off with the idea that we know that Chazal's lashon is that it's a house that has shalom bias, and we know the definition of shalom is in fact that doesn't refer to peace, which is a lack of a negative. It refers to a positive attribute, and the positive attribute is the idea that a person is able to expand his own sense of self-definition such that included in the definition to himself of what he is now the individual whom he has married. And essentially what this does is a fascinating thing, which is that, as is well known, as a single person, the manner in which we identify and assign relevance and importance to things is in terms of how they affect our own selves. That's how we assign importance. How much does this affect me? How is this important to me? Now, when someone gets married, what they're essentially doing is that they are shifting their orientation to the world such that they now have to assign relevance to reality from the perspective of their spouse, meaning that they come out of themselves completely and they now have to believe and understand and look at the world from the vantage point of their spouse and assign relevance to what their spouse assigns relevance to. And this is the blueprint for the ability of someone to truly relate to another human being and care about them in a real way, because they're expanding their own sense of self. And once that's accomplished, then a person can go ahead and they can truly care about other people, care about Kadosh Baruch Hu, which is why the Gemara says in many places that a person is not called a human being, is not called an Adam until he's married, and he's benidoy l'shamayim. The Gemara in Yevamos, a person is benidoy l'shamayim until he gets married, and that's the reason because a person is not truly capable of relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu until he can come out of himself and assign relevance in a real way to the perspective and the reality of somebody else. Once you can do that, once you do that with your wife, and you operate on a regular basis from a place of complete and utter selflessness in terms of the idea that you now are assigning relevance first and foremost to somebody else, then you can have a relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, etc. So we go back to the idea that the Yod and the K is what makes the relationship of Isha, which is what makes the primary location of Mashras Ashkina. And then we also have the pasuk which says, "Ki b'ko Hashem tzurei lamed." B'ko Hashem tzurei lamed means that in Yod Hey is the tzur, is the rock of Olamim, of everything, of the world, and the lashon of tzur and the lashon of tzayar, to be mitzayer. That's how the Gemara darshans that pasuk. B'ko Hashem tzurei lamed is that Hashem is the mitzayer. He is the one who is Yoitzer, who gave shape and format to reality. And what's obvious is that the connection between Sur and Sire is that Sur is a rock, and Sire means to give structure to. And by definition, in order to give structure to something, it has to be solid. It has to be very, very solid. I mean, the structure, the boundaries, and the concepts which give formation to reality must be solid. And therefore, the tzur, which is the rock, and the tzayir, which is the giving shape to, are the same word. And so, kibakah Hashem tzurei lamed, and the ka that comes out from Isha, which is the main place by Mashras Shechina, comes out that the yesod of having the Shechina being Shireh is when a person is able to encompass somebody else in the definition of what they are and perceive reality from their point of view and include them in their own definition, then he essentially gives himself to become the basis of reality for that individual. And because he's able to see everything through that person's perspective, and then he takes the action as an expression of who he is to bring pleasure to the person according to that way that person wants and assigns value and pleasure. And in Mela, essentially what we're tying is that the sur, the idea of that a person can be tsur, can have the kibbuch Hashem tzurei lamed within Mashras Shechina, is that people who are able to do this and encompass others within the definition of what they are, in fact, are the ones who have shaped history. In other words, the reason that we know now of a man who was named Avram Avinu is because Avram Avinu comprises a baseline for our own senses of what reality is. Because without Avram Avinu, there wouldn't be such a thing as the Yiddishkeit. Meaning we take for granted Avram Avinu exists, Chesed exists, everything he stands for exists, is true, is part of what we are, and then we go on with our days. Now, as we take that idea and the idea of his existence for granted in terms of how we orient ourselves as to what reality is. So therefore, the idea of them being tzur is this very idea. In other words, Avram Avinu is the rock of Judaism. He's the Sayar. He is the one who is going to give shape and give format to the world and to history. And Memela, that's the pshat. The same thing with Yitzchak, same thing as Yaakov. All of these people, the premise of that was that they were lech lecha, had to be for themselves. And as we said last week, the Yerucha means that they expand the definition of what they are to include other people, include everyone, and that's the whole side of going to the Hay, because Av Hamon Goyim. Hashem, the Avram is in charge now of all of the Goyim. So it's very, very clear that that's the theme. And essentially what's being said is that there isn't such a thing really, there is never such a thing really as relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as an entity which is separate from the reality of who you are. And the only real way to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to be like HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then, once you're like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then you have a deep awareness of his existence, and therefore you will be aware of him. And now that we understand that, now we can understand the pshat of the Gemara. The Gemara says that Avram Avinu told Eliezer to go out and see if there was a guest. And he went out and he said there was no one outside. And then Avram Avinu went out and he saw Kodesh Baruch Hu. The pshat is not that when Eliezer went out, Kodesh Baruch Hu wasn't there, and when Avram Avinu came out, he appeared. That's not pshat. The pshat is that Kodesh Baruch Hu was there the entire time. The only thing is that Eliezer was not able to perceive him. Eliezer was not able to have an awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu because Eliezer was not similar to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the same level that Avram Avinu was. And Mimela, since that's true, so now you understand Veisa Musa Ba'abdi means that there is no Emunah in Abdi, means that Emunah essentially refers to the idea, as we say, that it refers to the idea that a person is believed, in other words, that he himself is someone who is consistent and to be relied upon, and Ne'eman is someone who is relied upon, and therefore the idea of the Emunah is to be Ne'eman, to be believed, to be relied upon, and that refers to the ability to truly create a sense of self-definition which permeates a person's being to the point that there is no chance that he is going to, as a person, ever not behave and not do the things that identity structure which he embodied in himself would dictate. And that's what Leis Emunah Ba'avdi means. It means that even though Eliezer was a tremendous tzaddik, it wasn't the definition of who he was, because he was a Kanani. Since he was a Kanani, so Mamela, he didn't have that koyach. And Avram Avinu did, and therefore when Avram Avinu came out, he saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was there the entire time. And Mamela, we can now understand the idea. We asked the kasha that the Malachim were not real, so Avram didn't really do chesed. And if he didn't really do chesed, so then what was the point of this whole thing, and what schar does it get him? Because the Malachim didn't really need what he wanted, what he gave them, and he didn't actually help anybody. So how can it be that he's getting schar for that? That was our kasha. So now, based off what we said, we can answer the kasha and we can taina, and we can say that, as is understood, that when Avram Avinu is mitztaer, because he can't do a chesed zarfin. So in other words, for most people, when they say that they do chesed, so essentially what it means is that someone is in need, and then they respond to that need. So I need a favor. So if you're someone who we consider Baal Chesed is someone who does favors for people. They ask for favors, they need things, and he responds to their need for chesed. But by Avram Avinu in the stage of Bris Milah, that wasn't pshat, because at this point, again, there was no one out. And this is really the kasha. This is really the answer to the famous kasha that, how does it make sense to what Hashem did? Hashem is taking out the son, even though he knows that Avram Avinu is going to want to do chesed, and then Avram Avinu is mitztayer, and then he halachim who are going to come, even though there's a lot of sun. If Hashem knows everything, he knows that Avram is going to be mitztayer, so why would he bring out the son in the first place? It's like, Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't know he was going to be in pain, then he got in pain, so then he brought malachim. It doesn't make sense. Just don't bring out the son in the first place, because Hashem knows everything. Hashem knows Avram is going to be mitztayer. The answer is that the whole point of this was that Avram Avinu's new level was such that it had to be that he was expressing the ideas which comprised who he was on a proactive basis, which means that Avraham Avinu didn't do chesed because someone needed a favor and therefore he responded to that person's need. Avraham Avinu was mitztayer, he was in pain that he couldn't do chesed, even though there was no one to do chesed for. Which means that chesed encompassed and was Avram's entire definition, to the point that even though there was no one to do chesed for, he was in pain from the fact that he couldn't do chesed. And that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to bring out. So first you make it that there's no one to do chesed for. So if the idea of chesed is only reactionary, so now there is no one for you to react to, because the sun is out. But if the definition of chesed encompasses who you are, and it's mamash who you are, so then you're going to be mitzta'er to the point that you're in pain that you can't do chesed because it's mamash who you are. Just like I can't express myself. So then once he actualizes that level, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings him people to do chesed for. But the main yesod was the fact that Avraham Avinu needed to express the idea of him doing chesed as the Matthias of what he is, as opposed to a reaction to anyone else.